The invitation arrived on a Monday, delivered in an envelope so rigid and pristine it felt like a slab of cold marble. Kang Jae-hoon didn't need to break the seal to recognize the sender. That specific shade of cream, whispering of inherited wealth and sanitized legacies, was Shinarai's final insult. He sliced it open with a pocket knife he usually reserved for more visceral business, the blade catching the light like a warning. The card inside was a masterpiece of arrogance. Embossed gold letters announced the union of his former fiancée to the son of a senator, a man whose only merit was a surname clean enough to scrub the blood from Narai's family reputation. The wedding was in 2 weeks. It wasn't an invitation, it was a subpoena. A public execution meant to prove that the Mafia prince had been discarded for a more respectable merger. Jae-hoon placed the card on his mahogany desk, a stark white rectangle against the dark, polished wood of his empire. From his penthouse office, 30 floors above the neon pulse of Seoul, he ruled a world of chrome and shadows. But this invitation was a crack in his fortress of control, a declaration of social war disguised as a celebration of love. He felt the familiar, calculated coldness settle in his chest. Narai's family had cited his unsuitability as the reason for ending their engagement, a polite way of saying his money was too dark for their new political aspirations. They expected him to stay in the shadows, to play the part of the defeated ghost. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching the indifferent lights of the city. No, he would not be a ghost. He would be an eclipse. To bring a socialite from his own circle would be too predictable, a desperate attempt to match their move. He needed a wild card. He needed a disruption so visceral that the golden cage of Seoul's elite would shatter upon impact. He needed someone authentic, fearless, and utterly unimpressed by their gilded world. He found her exactly where he expected, in the drafty, sterile kitchen of the Shia estate, where the help was treated as part of the architecture. Her name was Zara Smith. While the rest of the staff scurried in terror of Narai's pre-wedding tantrums, Zara moved with a quiet, observant intellect hidden behind a maid's uniform. She was a vision of repressed power, her posture too elegant for the chores she was assigned. Then came the inciting incident. Jae-hoon was in the hallway, finishing a final, icy meeting with Narai's father when a crash echoed from the dressing room. He watched through the cracked door as Narai stood over Zara, her face contorted in a mask of perfect rage. "You've ruined the lace," Narai hissed, her hand snapping out in a sharp, stinging slap across Zara's cheek. "You're a maid, Zara. You're supposed to be invisible, not incompetent." Jae-hoon watched, intrigued by the reaction. There was no tears, no stuttered apologies. Zara simply stood her ground, her eyes steady and unblinking, holding the bride's gaze with a serene defiance that bordered on lethal. "The lace isn't ruined, Miss Narai," Zara replied, her voice a calm, low velvet that cut through the bride's hysteria. "It's simply delicate. Much like a reputation, it requires a gentle touch, not a heavy hand." It was a strike that drew blood without leaving a mark. Narai, momentarily neutered by the maid's composure, could only sputter before storming out. Jae-hoon remained in the shadows, mesmerized. Zara wasn't just a girl in a uniform. She was a master of control, wielding grace like a weapon in a house that sought to break her. In that moment, his reckless gamble crystallized into a concrete plan. She was perfect. She was the beautiful, elegant disruption he needed to burn the wedding down. He waited until the house fell silent, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floors. Zara was hanging up her apron in the darkened pantry when he approached, a shadow detaching itself from the corner where he had been waiting to offer her the lead role in his masterpiece of revenge. Before we continue, please like and subscribe. It's very important. Comment your name and where you are watching from. Let's continue. The air in the Shia estate was thick with the scent of gardenias and the suffocating tension of a bride-to-be losing her mind. Zara Smith stood motionless as a mannequin, her fingers steady despite the chaos swirling around her. She was currently a living pedestal, draped in yards of Chantilly lace that Narai had decided was too white for her complexion. Zara felt the heavy, manicured hand of her employer press into her shoulder, using her as a literal brace, while Narai shrieked at a florist over the phone. To the elite of Seoul, Zara was part of the background, as invisible as the silver trays she polished and as disposable as the napkins she folded. Are you even listening, Zara? Narai snapped, tossing the phone onto a velvet sofa. She turned her venom toward the woman holding her dress. You've been pinning this for an hour. If there is a single wrinkle during the rehearsal, I'll ensure you're blacklisted from every agency in the city. Zara didn't flinch. She adjusted a pearl-headed pin with surgical precision, her dark skin a striking contrast against the pale fabric. The silk is delicate, Miss Narai. It requires patience to hang correctly, Zara replied, her voice a low, melodic hum that betrayed nothing of the irritation simmering beneath her ribs. Across the room, obscured by the heavy velvet drapes of the library entrance, Kang Jae-hoon watched the scene with the detached interest of a predator. He was there for a final, transactional meeting with Narai's father, but the domestic theater in the dressing room caught his eye. He had expected to see a broken servant. Instead, he saw a woman whose silence was not a sign of submission, but a calculated tactical retreat. Narai, fueled by pre-wedding nerves and a lifetime of unchecked privilege, suddenly grabbed a pair of shears from the vanity. In a fit of pique, she slashed at a loose thread near Zara's hand, the cold metal grazing Zara's knuckles. You're slow and dull, Narai hissed. I don't know why my mother keeps you around. You're just a shadow. Zara finally looked up. For a split second, the invisible girl vanished, and something ancient and fierce flickered in her gaze, a burning fire that Jae-hoon recognized instantly. It was the look of a person who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. She didn't cry or recoil. She simply took the shears from Narai's shaking hand with a terrifyingly graceful grip. I am a shadow, Miss Narai, Zara said, her eyes locked onto the bride's. And shadows are the only things that follow you into the dark. From his vantage point, Jae-hoon felt a rare smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. He didn't see a maid anymore. He saw a kindred spirit cloaked in a uniform, a wild card waiting to be played. The subterranean air of the Shi estate's wine cellar was thick with the scent of damp earth and aging oak, a chilling sanctuary away from the upstairs hysteria. Zara stood among the racks of dusty vintage Bordeaux, her hands finally trembling as she reached for a bottle of 1945 Mouton Rothschild, the bride's demand for a celebratory pre-wedding drink. The sting on her cheek from Narai's slap had settled into a dull, rhythmic throb, a physical reminder of her place in a world that viewed her as a ghost in a uniform. A Bordeaux that old doesn't like to be rushed, a voice drawled from the shadows, smooth and cold as a razor blade. Zara didn't scream. She slowly turned to find Kang Jae-hoon leaning against a stone pillar, his expensive suit a dark blotch against the amber light of the cellar. He looked less like a wedding guest and more like the devil contemplating a soul he intended to buy. Mr. Kang, Zara said, her voice regaining its ironclad composure. The wine cellar is off-limits to guests. I'm sure Miss Narai is looking for you. Miss Narai is looking for a reflection of herself, Jae-hoon replied, stepping into the light. His eyes, sharp and predatory, tracked the faint red mark on her face. But I'm looking for something else. I'm looking for the woman who told a monster that shadows follow you into the dark. He walked toward her, the space between them shrinking until Zara could smell the faint, expensive tobacco on his coat. He didn't look at her with the pity she loathed. He looked at her with the recognition of a fellow soldier. I have a proposal, Zara Smith, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Narai thinks she's winning. She thinks she can discard me for a cleaner name and humiliate me by having me watch her walk down the aisle. She expects me to be a ghost at her feast. Zara tilted her head, her curiosity flickering despite herself. And what does the Mafia boss want from a maid? I don't want a maid. I want a lead role, Jae-hoon said, his gaze intensifying. I want you to shed that uniform. I want you to walk into that ballroom on my arm, draped in silk and diamonds, and remind every person in that room that they are only elite because they say they are. I want you to replace her. He pulled a check from his inner pocket, the ink fresh, the numbers followed by enough zeros to change several lifetimes. He tucked it into the pocket of her apron, a devil's bargain delivered with a smirk. This is for the performance. When the night is over, you never have to scrub a floor again. You'll have the resources to be the person you're currently pretending not to be. Zara looked at the check, then back at the man who viewed the world as a chessboard. She knew this was a tactical gamble fueled by his pride, but she also saw a chance to dismantle the house that had treated her like furniture. "I don't just want the money, Mr. Kang," Zara said, her voice turning lethal. "If I do this, I do it my way. I won't be a silent prop." Jae-hoon's smile widened, sharp and satisfied. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The transition from shadow to spectacle began in the clinical silence of Jae-hoon's private penthouse, a space of glass and steel that overlooked the city like a sniper's nest. For 48 hours, the world of the Shi estate ceased to exist, replaced by a grueling curriculum of posture, social weaponry, and the curated art of the elite. Jae-hoon didn't hire a team of stylists. He oversaw the process himself, watching Zara with a critical, predatory eye as she shed the starch-heavy maid's uniform that had acted as her camouflage for years. The physical transformation was a clinical exercise in reclaiming power. Zara endured the abrasive touch of high-end exfoliants and the meticulous sculpting of her natural hair until it framed her face like a dark, regal halo. She was no longer the invisible girl folding laundry. She was being forged into a tactical nuke designed to vaporize Narai's composure. Jae-hoon provided a closet of muted tones, beiges and pale creams meant to mimic the clean aesthetic of the political class, but Zara pushed them aside with a look of quiet disdain. "If I am to be a disruption," she said, her voice a low velvet that commanded the room, "I will not hide in their colors." She chose the scarlet silk, a gown the color of fresh arterial blood that clung to her frame with an architectural precision. The dress was an act of war in itself, featuring an off-the-shoulder neckline that showcased the regal line of her collarbones and a silhouette that demanded every eye in a room surrender to her presence. When she finally stepped out of the dressing suite, the air in the penthouse seemed to thin. She wore a heavy gold medallion that sat against her chest like a shield, her expression one of liquid grace and absolute focus. Jae-hoon, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, turned to face her. For the first time since they had met in the wine cellar, the Mafia boss looked genuinely disarmed. He had intended to create a silent prop, a beautiful accessory to facilitate his revenge, but the woman standing before him possessed a natural royalty that made the very idea of a contract feel insulting. Zara didn't just look like she belonged in the Shilla Hotel ballroom. She looked like she owned the ground it was built upon. "Narai spent 20 years trying to buy this kind of presence," Jae-hoon remarked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, admiring hum as he stepped closer. "She only ever managed to fake it. You, Zara, you look like the truth they're all terrified of." Zara met his gaze, her eyes steady and unblinking, already inhabiting the role of the global tech heiress they had concocted. The metamorphosis was complete. The maid was dead, and the queen was ready to attend a wedding. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, but inside the library, the air felt thick with the weight of the elaborate lie they were weaving. Jae-hoon sat across from Zara, a dossier of forged documents spread between them like a map of a stolen country. To the vipers at the Shilla Hotel, Zara Smith would no longer exist. In her place stood Zara Vane, an Afro-European venture capitalist with a penchant for disruptive tech and a reputation for liquid grace in the boardroom. "You were educated in Zurich, refined in London, and your firm specializes in high-stakes acquisitions," Jae-hoon stated, his voice a low, clinical drone as he drilled the details into her memory. He watched her closely, looking for a crack in her composure, but Zara absorbed the data with a poised professionalism that made the fabrication feel like a homecoming. She didn't just memorize the facts. She inhabited the spirit of the woman who would walk into a room and expect it to tilt in her direction. As the night deepened, the clinical nature of their rehearsal began to fray, revealing an unsettling authenticity beneath the transaction. Jae-hoon poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the moonlight as he leaned back, his guard dropping for the first time. He spoke of his own empire, one built in the shadows and governed by a calculated anger that the inbred elite of Seoul could never understand. "They look at me and see a monster with a clean suit," Jae-hoon admitted, his gaze fixed on the city lights that seemed indifferent to his power. And they look at you and see a shadow that cleans their floors. We are both disruptions to their sterile world, Zara. We are the outsiders they think they can buy or bury. Zara felt a shiver of recognition. She thought of the years she had spent being undervalued and observant, a ghost in the household of a woman who didn't know her last name. For the first time, she saw the man behind the Mafia boss, a man who, despite his billions, shared her isolated reality of being a weapon used by those who feared its edge. "They fear what they can't control," Zara replied, her voice soft but echoing with a burning fire that matched his own. "Narai doesn't hate me because I'm a maid. She hates me because I see the rot behind her perfect composure. And she hates you because you don't need her permission to exist." In that shared moment of vulnerability, the fake relationship between the crime heir and the maid shifted into something far more dangerous: mutual respect. They were no longer just a boss and an employee executing a tactical nuclear strike on a wedding. They were two people who had spent their lives being commodified, now choosing to use that invisibility as a shield. "Tomorrow the game begins," Jaihoon said, raising his glass in a silent toast. "But tonight, let's remember why we're doing this. It's not just for the spectacle, it's to watch their gilded cage shatter." The Shilla Hotel was a temple of ivory and gold, a fortress of sterile perfection designed to broadcast the triumph of the elite to the rest of Seoul. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of 5,000 imported lilies and the low, performative hum of discreet power. Narai stood near the altar in her pristine white lace, a vision of curated perfection, as she prepared to marry into a lineage clean enough to scrub the blood from her own. The ballroom of vipers watched with polite, frozen smiles, waiting for the ceremony to cement a lucrative merger, built on branding rather than romance. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the hall swung open with a rhythmic thud that cut through the string quartet's melody like a tactical nuclear strike. Kang Jaihoon stepped into the light, his presence shattering the room's carefully maintained composure. He didn't look like a man publicly discarded. He looked like a king returning to claim a debt. But it was the woman on his arm who caused the collective breath of the room to hitch. Zara Smith, now the formidable Zara Vane, moved with a liquid grace that made the sprawling ballroom feel small. The scarlet silk of her gown was a vibrant, aggressive contrast to the sea of muted pastels and sterile whites. Every eye followed the sweep of the blood-red fabric and the heavy gold medallion that rested against her chest like a shield. Her posture was elegant, and her focus absolute, radiating a natural royalty that made the socialites around her look like pale imitations. A ripple of panicked whispers spread through the crowd as Jaihoon led her toward the front of the room. Narai's perfect composure began to crack as she caught sight of the woman she had once called invisible. The bride's eyes widened, her gloved hands tightening around her bouquet of white roses as she realized the shadow from her dressing room had returned as the main event. Jaihoon didn't look at his ex-fiancée. His gaze was fixed on Zara, a calculated smirk tugging at his lips as he witnessed the spectacle they had created. He felt a surge of mutual respect as Zara navigated the ballroom of vipers with unblinking eyes, her presence delegitimatizing the entire ceremony before a single vow was spoken. The maid had returned as a queen, and as she and Jaihoon took their seats in the front row, the golden cage of Seoul's elite felt suddenly, dangerously fragile. The disruption was complete. The wild card had been played, and the game was no longer under the bride's control. The reception hall hummed with a fragile, glass-brittle tension as Zara rose from her seat, her movements possessing a liquid grace that drew every eye like a moth to a flame. The scarlet silk of her gown whispered against the floor as she approached the stage, the heavy gold medallion around her neck catching the light like a trophy of war. Jaihoon watched her from the front table, his calculated expression hiding a burgeoning sense of mutual respect for the woman who was about to deliver a tactical nuclear strike to the ceremony's curated heart. When Zara took the microphone, the room went so silent that the clink of a single silver spoon felt like a gunshot. She didn't look at the groom. She looked directly at Narai, whose perfect composure was visibly fraying under the weight of Zara's gaze. "They say that a wedding is a celebration of a new beginning," Zara began, her voice a low velvet that carried to the furthest corners of the ballroom. "But as a woman who has spent her life in the business of acquisition and refinement, I prefer to see it as a final audit of one's assets." A ripple of confused, nervous laughter moved through the crowd, but Zara's face remained serene and unblinking. "I have spent a great deal of time in houses like this one," she continued, her eyes flashing with a burning fire that only Jae-hoon truly understood. "Houses built on legacies so fragile they must be polished every hour. In my world, we learn that the most expensive things are often the most hollow. We see people who think they can scrub the blood from their names with a new contract, or hide their rotten core behind a layer of white lace." Narai's hands began to shake, her bouquet of white roses trembling as Zara leaned into the microphone. "It is a fascinating process, trying to refine trash into a masterpiece," Zara said, her tone perfectly even. "But a true connoisseur knows that a diamond found in the dirt is still a diamond, while a gilded cage is still just a cage for those too weak to fly. Miss Narai has spent her life trying to ensure everything around her is invisible or sterile. But she forgot that the most powerful disruptions come from the shadows she ignored." The toast was a masterpiece of polite destruction, a poisoned tribute that delegitimatized the union without Zara ever raising her voice. As she stepped down from the stage, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Narai looked not like a triumphant bride, but like a woman whose perfectly curated world had just been exposed as a sham. Zara returned to Jae-hoon's side, her posture elegant and her focus absolute. He leaned in, his voice a dangerous, admiring hum. "You didn't just draw blood, Zara," he whispered. "You burned the whole house down." The heavy silence following Zara's toast was broken by the sharp, rhythmic clapping of a single pair of hands. Narai's brother, Shi Myung-di, stepped forward from a circle of sneering socialites, his face flushed with a mixture of expensive scotch and wounded ego. He was a man whose entire identity was built on the branding of his family name, and he had recognized the invisible girl beneath the scarlet silk. To him, Zara was not a venture capitalist. She was the girl who had spent 3 years cleaning his mud-caked shoes without a word of complaint. "A fascinating performance, Ms. Vane," Myung-di drawled, his voice loud enough to carry across the ballroom of vipers. He signaled a passing waiter, snatching a bottle of vintage champagne and a single flute. He didn't offer it to her. Instead, he held the bottle out with an imperious flick of his wrist, a cruel smirk twisting his features. "Since you're so fond of refining things, why don't you show us your expertise? Pour me a drink. After all, you've had plenty of practice in my father's house, haven't you?" The room held its breath, the air turning sterile and cold. This was the unmasking, a deliberate attempt to publicly neuter Zara by reminding everyone of her working-class background. Narai watched from the altar, a flicker of triumphant malice returning to her eyes as she waited for Zara to crumble under the weight of her own lie. Jae-hoon's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, his calculated anger ready to erupt, but Zara placed a calming hand on his sleeve. She didn't recoil or flush with shame. Instead, she took the bottle with a liquid grace that bordered on the supernatural. She examined the label of the Krug Close Dambonnet with a serene focus, then looked Myung-di directly in the eye. "A 1995 vintage," she remarked, her voice a low velvet that commanded absolute silence. "A bold choice for someone who usually prefers things that are easily replaced." With terrifying elegance, she popped the cork, not with a loud, vulgar explosion, but with a faint, sophisticated hiss that signaled a master's touch. She poured the liquid into the flute, stopping exactly a quarter-inch from the rim without spilling a single drop. She didn't hand him the glass. She set it on a nearby silver tray and slid it toward him with a polite, professional smile that drew blood. "I'm afraid I must decline your request to serve you, Myung-di," Zara said, her tone perfectly even. "In my world, we only serve those who are accustomed to the earthier notes of reality. You, however, seem to be struggling with a corked personality. Perhaps you should stick to something simpler, like water. It requires much less of a pedigree to understand." Myung-di stood frozen, the champagne glass trembling in his hand. He had tried to make her look like the help, but in her presence, he was the one who looked low-class, desperate, and rotten. The invisible girl had not just survived the unmasking, she had used his own arrogance to expose the superficiality of his gilded cage. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel had transformed from a sanctuary of elite tradition into a theater of the absurd. At the head table, the air was heavy with the scent of gardenias and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending social collapse. Kang Jae-hoon sat anchored in his chair, his tailored navy suit a sharp silhouette against the white linens. He leaned in toward Zara, his shoulder nearly brushing her scarlet silk, his expression one of dawning fascination. He had spent his life controlling outcomes, but as he watched Zara, he realized he was no longer the director of this play. He was a spectator to a force of nature. Shinarai hovered behind them, her pristine white veil trembling with every jagged breath she took. The curated perfection of her wedding day had been incinerated by the presence of the woman she had once deemed invisible. Unable to contain the mounting panic, Narai lunged forward, her gloved hands gripping the back of Zara's chair until her knuckles turned white. "How dare you?" Narai hissed, her voice a fractured whisper that struggled to maintain its aristocratic polish. "You're a thief. You stole that dress, you stole that jewelry, and you're trying to steal a life that doesn't belong to you. You are nothing but the girl who scrubs my floors, Zara. Look at me when I speak to you." Zara didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, her liquid grace undisturbed by the bride's vitriol. She met Narai's frantic gaze with eyes that were steady, unblinking, and terrifyingly serene. "I'm looking at you, Narai," Zara replied, her voice a low velvet hum that made Jae-hoon's pulse quicken. "And for the first time, I think everyone else in this room is looking at you, too. Not at the lace or the pearls or the senator's son. They are looking at the rotten core you tried so hard to hide behind a maid's silence." Narai's face contorted, her perfect composure shattering into a million tiny pieces. "You think this man cares about you? You're a tactical nuke to him, Zara, a weapon for petty revenge. Once this night is over, he'll discard you just like I would have." Zara tilted her head, a faint, lethal smile playing on her lips as she glanced at Jae-hoon, who remained mesmerized by her power. "Perhaps," Zara said, turning back to the bride. "But even as a weapon, I have more agency than you ever did as a bride. You sold yourself for a lucrative merger to save a sinking ship. I'm here because I chose to burn it down." The groom, standing just out of the frame, stepped forward, his face ashed with the dawning realization of Zara's earlier poisoned toast. Zara didn't wait for him to speak. She leaned toward him, delivering the final, tactical nuclear strike, while Narai watched in horror. "Ask her about the accounts, Minister," Zara murmured, her voice carrying just enough weight to be heard by the surrounding tables. "Ask her why the Shi legacy is being liquidated in the shadows while you're standing here promising her your name. She didn't want a husband. She wanted a bailout for her family's rot." The groom's gaze snapped to Narai, whose sudden, suffocating silence was the only confession the room needed. As if the humiliation was not enough. Zara turned slowly, her gaze serene. "I know enough, Narai," Zara replied, her voice a low velvet hum. "I know that while you were wearing the engagement ring Jae-hoon gave you, you were spending your Tuesday afternoons at the Shilla's penthouse with the man you're standing next to today." The room lost its oxygen. Jae-hoon's jaw tightened as the truth hit the table. "I was the one who laundered your clothes," Zara continued, looking at the horrified groom. "I found the gold crest of the senator's family, this man's family, tucked under your pillow 3 months before you broke your engagement with Jae-hoon." The groom stepped back in horror, and the marriage shattered on the spot. Jae-hoon let out a short, dark laugh. "It turns out I was just the only one in the room playing by the rules." The marriage didn't just stumble, it broke on the spot. The groom stepped back, the white roses in Narai's bouquet seemingly wilting in real time as he turned his back on the altar. Jae-hoon leaned even closer to Zara, his gaze a calculated mix of shock and mutual respect. He had wanted a spectacle, but Zara had given him a revolution. As the ballroom of vipers erupted into a cacophony of hushed scandals and Narai collapsed into her chair, Jae-hoon realized that his fake contract was the only thing in the room that had lost its value. He wasn't sitting next to a maid or a pawn. He was sitting next to the only person who had ever truly seen the man behind the monster. The heavy, gilded doors of the Shilla Hotel swung shut behind them, sealing away the wreckage of the Shi dynasty and the muted roar of 1,000 ruined reputations. The night air of Seoul was sharp and cold, a bracing contrast to the suffocating incense of the ballroom. As they stepped into the back of the sleek, black sedan, the city lights blurred into long ribbons of neon, reflecting off the windows like the shadows they had finally stepped out of. For a long moment, silence filled the cabin, a silence no longer dictated by the rigid protocols of a mafia boss and his silent prop, but by the heavy weight of what had just transpired. Zara leaned back against the leather seat, the scarlet silk of her gown catching the passing streetlights, her absolute focus finally softening into a weary but triumphant glow. Beside her, Kang Jae-hoon remained motionless, his mesmerized gaze still fixed on her profile, as if he were seeing a masterpiece for the very first time. Slowly, Jae-hoon reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out the $50,000 check, the devil's bargain that had started this strategic gamble in a damp wine cellar. He looked at the paper, then at Zara, whose natural royalty made the high-priced ink look like a cheap insult. "You once said that a fine wine doesn't always reveal its best qualities to those who are impatient," Jae-hoon said, his voice a dangerous, admiring hum that vibrated in the small space. With a deliberate, steady motion, he gripped the edges of the check and tore it down the middle. He didn't stop until the paper was reduced to a handful of white confetti, a fake contract for a relationship that had become unsettlingly authentic. He let the scraps flutter to the floor of the car, discarding the transactional nature of their union along with the remnants of his petty revenge. "I don't want a maid, Zara," he murmured, leaning closer until the scent of his expensive tobacco mingled with the fatting gardenias on her skin. "And I certainly don't want a fake fiancé to parade in front of a ballroom of vipers who aren't worthy of breathing the same air as you." Zara met his gaze, her eyes steady and unblinking, the burning fire in them now tempered by a burgeoning curiosity. "Then what do you want, Mr. Kang? The spectacle is over. The main event has left the building." "I want the woman who just conquered Seoul," Jae-hoon replied, his calculated mask finally falling away to reveal a man seeking something his billions could never buy, authentic human agency. He reached out not to command her, but to offer a hand with a vulnerability that shattered his facade of fortress-like control. "I want a real date. No backstories. No New York art curators. No global tech personas. Just you on your own terms." Zara looked at the discarded check, then at the man who had seen her striking beauty and sharp intellect when the rest of the world saw a shadow. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she placed her hand in his, her liquid grace sealing a new, unwritten agreement. As the car sped toward the heart of the city, the mafia boss and the woman who had dismantled a dynasty left the gilded cage behind, moving together into a future where they were no longer ghosts, but the masters of their own game. Thank you for watching till the end. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. You are valuable to us. See you in the next story.